Whenever you're ready, we're ready.
Well done, everybody, for remembering what to do when I tap the microphone. Give yourselves a pat on the back. Awesome. And also well done for battling through, all the Edinburgh diversions. I think I went through a road that didn't exist earlier today, even though it's blatantly from the 1400s. It's magic. Anyway, enough of that. It's a real pleasure to have everyone out. It's lovely to be back here at the Lighthouse as well for a launch. I am Charlie Roy. I'm one half of Studio Rhubarb Press, in case you're wondering what I'm doing here. And we're here to celebrate the launch of Catherine Wilson Garry's Another Word for Home is Blackbird.
I don't know if I clap or if that just looks really, really smug and self-important. Yeah, I did write that.
I think this is the night where you can give yourself a round of applause. This is definitely the day. And yes, congratulations on having your debut out. It's very exciting. I'm not going to waffle for too long. I'm going to tell you a few bits and pieces, though, mostly about Catherine, who I'm sure you know who Catherine is. That's why you're here. However, I'm going to do the official bit, and I will read the blurb of her bio. Yeah, you ready for this? I like doing this, but I'm reading it because my memory is not good. So here we go. Catherine Wilson Garry is a spoken word poet and writer based in Edinburgh. Her work has been published by Extra Teeth, Gutter, and The Scotsman. She has also been commissioned by the University of Edinburgh, Stanza Poetry Festival, and the British National Gallery. In 2022, she was shortlisted for the Moniac Moore Emerging Writer Award. In 2018, she represented Scotland at Transpoesy Festival in Belgium, where her work was displayed across Brussels' public transport system, as well as having her digital poetry project, Homefound, shown at the Public Poetry Festival USA and Poetry Arsenal in Ukraine. Out with her own writing, she has hosted poetry events, including Soapbox Open Mic from 2015 to 2017, Scotland's largest poetry slam across 2015-2016, and Push the Boat Out Festival's open mic, Rock the Boat, since 2021. She's also a regular contributor to BBC Radio Scotland as one of their reviewers on the Tuesday afternoon show with Janice Forsyth. Yeah. Still be amazing. And now she's published with Studio Rhubarb Press. Yeah. So you're going to read us a few poems. We're going to start with that, a few poems, and then we'll have a wee chat. And then you guys can ask some questions if you like, if you've got any burning questions about the poetry or about Catherine. But not about Edinburgh's roadworks or bus routes.
Because I can talk about it as well. I'll talk about anything, honestly. Any questions, I'm ready.
Is that a challenge?
Yeah, no, I really regret saying that now. But yeah.
So would you like to start with some poems then?
Yes, of course.
Brilliant, thank you.
So yeah, I'm just gonna seamlessly fill out the microphone stand because that makes me feel like a much more professional spoken word poet person. So thank you so much everyone for coming. It's very nice to see a lot of people that I don't know. I was quite stressed it would just be like all of my pals. But it's lovely to have my pals as well, not to put anything on them like you should have stayed at home. So yeah, I've been writing and performing my poetry now, I think, since I was about 18. So, and I'm now 27. That took me a while. Coming up with 10 years. So some of you, if you've seen me before, you might have seen the era where it was doing poems about Scotland and flashing a pair of saltire boxers And if you've not seen me before, and you've, for some reason, this is a very strange first date setup, you might have seen the listing and go, oh my God, poems about grief. Oh my God, this is going to be so fucking miserable. But I promise, we're not doing saltire pants, but we're also not doing fucking miserable. We're in the middle. It's a spectrum. Poetry is a range of emotions. We're in the middle tonight. So this is a collection of poems that one of the topics is grief. And when I was thinking about writing about grief, some of that was very much my own and my own personal experiences. But the first poem I wanted to read was thinking about grief is actually something that's a lot more collective. I think we have a whole bunch of collective griefs at the moment right now. And not to get really, really heavy, but one of them, this poem is just about how we are not looking after the people who hold up society the most. I first wrote this poem a long time ago, and it was very much a kind of people watching poem because I love to people watch. That's where a lot of my writing comes from. And then when I was editing with Hannah Lavery, she was like, "You've written a union support the strikers poem," and I was like, "Have I?" And she was like, "Yes," and I was like, "It will be now. Anything for you, Hannah." Because if Hannah Lavery tells you your poem is a union poem, it's going to be a union poem. Like, I'm not letting Hannah Lavery down. So I thought I would open with this one. This is called Sonder. Every time we walk down the streets, 1,000 lives buzz around our heads like honeybees, busily homing their lives. I share my streets with philosophers, builders, lawyers, runners, trombone players, tram conductors, women who wanted to be scientists when they grew up, the picture book writer who stamps inspiration into the pillow creases of small minds. I want to snap this crowd in half and gift it to the sad faces pressed on the bus windows, or the young widows, or the elderly who still volunteer every Sunday, or the little girl who gets bullied at school for the way her front tooth refuses to fit in. I want to love these clumsy gods until my heart breaks, until I can't conjure up the words to do humanity justice, until the only skill I can write on my CV is to explain all the gaps is people watching. 22 years. I am lucky enough to be watching the first stone dropped in the pond and see its ripple buzzing forever around my architecture. In the late night small talk of Memento Mori, of the first poem that's on the stage that stays long after the microphone is switched off. In the quiet nights in, where love is soldered and burns so bright, the light bulbs shatter off at what they have witnessed. I want to collect more stones, pebble dash my pockets until I am heavy with possibility. Leave them instead of flowers that float away on the breeze, their presence persistently marking once they were here. They did this. Watch the sand shift around their existence from the bus driver who builds the schedules, to the barista who brews the start of the day like an orchestral warm-up, to the students with two eyes on tomorrow, to the protesters with two fists at the past, to the musicians who spend no time practicing because they're too busy tuning songs into pitches, to the librarian who categorizes creation, to the nurses and postmen, the teachers and rail workers, the cleaners and call center agents. I want the world to hold you better, for your joy to be unshakable, for the streets to float with the faces you hit with your everyday miracles. In the winter, a bumblebee queen shakes her whole body to keep her eggs warm. The movement of one is felt for a lifetime. Thank you. That's the longest poem I'm going to read tonight, so if you made it through that, you don't ever have to do that length again. What a terrible thing to say. The next poem, so I got this shiny accolade of like the British National Gallery asked me to write a poem for them, and they wanted a poem inspired by like their art collection, and instead I just wrote them a poem about art, and it was very funny because we went and performed it, and I don't think it's what they wanted, but forever I get to be like, British National Gallery commissioned me to write a poem. So this is this poem, and if anyone's from the British National Gallery, thank you for the money. I'm sorry, it's maybe not what we wanted, but it's published now, so it's legit. This is called Slice of Life. When I was a kid, my mother cut my hair outside, scattered it for birds' nests in the hope something could make a better home out of my split ends. I feel most at home in other people's. I like the days that quickly become nights, where we leave conversations feeling sea change, trying to spot the birds in the park at night. We all exist in different portions. To some, I might be the cups left in the sink, a dropped pen, the uncomfortable warmth on a loo seat. Yet, on the last train home, my head against a rainy window, a dream geologists find me. Uncover more than one wet pavement footprint. Some people only ever see Van Gogh on a postcard, but it still sits pride of place on a well-worn mantelpiece. So existentialism. One thing that I think this is like kind of a big message in this collection is the idea of existentialism as comforting, which sounds very bizarre, and I'm sure the existentialist philosophers would hate that I've used my philosophy degree to talk about this, but a lot of the poems in this collection are kind of about how when I've gone through something like a grief, or when there is something very overwhelming, like those public griefs, like those, or like just very intense experiences in my life, something I find so comforting is just thinking about how small I am, which I think like probably should be the reverse. But I think, yeah, so much of my kind of perspective on life is a lot of the poems in this are about birds and bird watching. And there was kind of two periods in my life where bird watching was a big deal. And one of them was when I was a child. My grandfather was very, very observant of birds. And this was something that, like, when we went to his house, he knew all the birds. And I was kind of interested, and I was given a book of birds at one point. And then the second point was when COVID happened. And I think before COVID, like, the idea of going for a walk, like, no, that is horrific. And I'm sorry, like, to all the people who love walking, but to me, I'd be like, you walk to go somewhere. The idea of just walking aimlessly just didn't compute for me. And so I would kind of try and find things to go and walk for. And one thing was there was like a pathway near us that was covered in little birds. And I was like, I'm going to go see those little birds. I'm going to try and figure out what they are. Sounds really menacing, actually. Now I think about it, like, who are you? Tiny bird, tell me your secrets. But there was something really comforting for me in watching them and watching nature a little bit, seeing that everything in my life felt on pause. But birds don't know about that, because birds don't know anything, because they're quite stupid. And that, in an existential way, was quite comforting to be like, I'm going through the worst day of my life, and the birds don't care. So I thought I would. The birds. I should have called this "The Birds Don't Care." I'm realizing. So one of the griefs I'll talk about a bit in this collection is my grandfather passed away when I was 18, and it was a really big loss because he was a close friend of my father. I have to explain now. I have a father and a dad, not in a gay way, sadly. I have a biological father and I have a dad. My dad came into my life when I was a little bit older, like 2 or 3. And so my dad's dad died. That was my grandfather died. And my grandfather being a good friend of my biological father. Are we keeping up? It's confusing. It's confusing for me. I have to carry this around. When my... This is like a lot. I don't unpack it. My family tree is so complicated. When my grandfather died, it was really sad because he had been friends with my father and they had this interest in philosophy. And 18 was the point where I started studying philosophy and getting really interested in it. So when my grandfather died and I was like studying philosophy, I kind of felt like all the links to my father who passed away before I was born were kind of disappearing. So yeah, the kind of bird watching thing kind of came back and was kind of interesting. So I'll still talk about existentialism and Dead Grandad's Iron I'll read the film. This one's called My Grandfather's Binoculars. Even though it's been 5 years, she kept his shoes in the porch, as if he would step right back into them and be found crouching over something in the garden. I kept him in my bookcase, his sons in how they order their lives. He seemed so lost in life that it only made sense for him to be overwhelmingly present in death. A beak taps at the window, and I find myself thinking of his binoculars, how they made the small so achingly big. Thank you. Okay. The last, you'll be really glad to know the last one does not have a lot of existentialist chat about it. It's just a poem about a pigeon. I wanted to write poems about different birds throughout the collection, and I feel very bad for pigeons because essentially we used to keep pigeons as pets. We domesticated them, we made them do jobs, and then we were like, we don't need you anymore, goodbye. And now they don't know like how to live. And have you ever, if you ever want to feel a bit sad about humanity, go and look at a picture of a pigeon's nest. It's like 2 twigs with a little egg in it because they don't know what to do. And we did that, and that's bad. So I thought, and everyone's so mean to pigeons, I thought I would write a little ode to a pigeon. Your nests are shite, mate. Fodder for mockery. No attempt at architecture or consideration for your unborn, which roll away like dropped pennies. And then I remember the breeding, the post rooms, the science labs, and somehow, against the odds of pet cats and missing feet and angry signs at train stations that demand we ignore you and starve you, somehow you're here, in the gap of every city and the soundtrack of every walk, like the wildflowers that grow through the concrete.
Thank you so much for that, Catherine. I love all the words in this pamphlet, which is why we chose it to publish, obviously. But I think when we're going through the submissions that we receive at Studio Rhubarb, we get quite a large stack of them, which is lovely. And it is my great joy to print them out and sit and spend time with them and read them. And there are certain topics that just do come up. So grief and so on do tend to come up. But we felt that, and I think those the poems that you just selected really speak to that, that you're not just looking at it through one particular lens and still bringing a lightness and hope to it. And that was something that we found that we really connected with, and maybe didn't need to know exactly every detail about your grandfather and so on. But I think finding that line to write about something like grief can be a very hard process. So when that's your inspiration, would you like to speak a bit about that process of kind of distilling, I guess?
Yeah, I think one thing that I think I've been thinking a lot about since writing this has been that I think grief gets categorized as like sadness. Like I think people can see grief as very synonymous with sadness or depression. And then the other way that grief gets categorized is like the stages of grief, like the idea that you're sad and then you're angry and then you're bargaining and then you're etc. And then you kind of get to this point where you've accepted it. And I think grief is just so much more complex in that there's actually a lot of anger. There's a lot of sadness, a lot of anger, but then there's also like there's a lot of awkwardness and there's a lot of tiredness and there's a lot of it's much more of like feeling soup rather than it's not clear. And I think like thinking about the kind of different people I've lost in my life, I very much go back and forth and sometimes I'm very, very sad and then sometimes feel a bit better and then sometimes I'm very, very angry and not necessarily angry at them, but the treatment from other people because they don't understand. And so I kind of wanted to reflect that, but I also wanted to talk a lot about solace and how solace can come in just very strange forms that you'll never expect. And I think that was, like, I think if you went back in time and told me when I was starting to write poems, like, yeah, your first collection is going to have a bunch of bird poems, I would be very, very confused because that's just not, I never thought I would write about those things. And I never thought that those would be something that inspired me or that gave me solace. So, yeah, I think I'm always, when I'm trying to write about grief, I'm always trying to be a bit more nuanced rather than just I didn't want this to be like unrelentingly sad, where you read it and then you cry and then you put it down and never read it again. I kind of wanted it to be more like this could maybe be useful to someone, whether they have gone through something themselves or know someone and want to kind of understand that better, I think.
Yeah, I think with the Poet's Eye, where you've captured that bird watching has been a really interesting thing to see, because I think you've managed to then open up, and the pigeon poem really captures this, but then Sondra talks about this too, where it's not just grief of losing a person. I think there's a grief in the urban landscape and the people around you, and political shifts and climate change, that's also in here. So you're kind of, and that could have ended up being quite a messy pamphlet, but you've kept it very focused. You've got the binocular, it's the binoculars. But what led you to then write about that kind of wider sense of grief and beyond death?
I mean, I don't even think it was necessarily like a conscious thought. It was more as I realised there was a through line when I was writing. I think for a long time I fell into the trap of feeling like I couldn't write about politics, because I was just like, but I kind of had this idea, I think this was from the spoken word background as well, that every political poem had to be like a rousing manifesto, that everyone at the end would be like, huzzah, correct, and now we ride it on. And actually, like, no, I think, although, if we're interested, we could write it on. Sorry, I was in a workshop today and they were like, can we identify this was at work, and they were like, can we identify what problems our organizations going to face? And I was like, climate change and capitalism, and everyone else was like, oh no, we meant more like budgets. And I was like, capitalism is always the problem. I think, I don't think I even, when I first started thinking about it, conceived it in those ways, but I do think COVID really reframed how people think about a lot of what we've been through, in that I still think it is absolutely wild that we've never even had like a day off where we all just went, God, we fucking lived through that and that was horrific, and like just mourned and just had 5 seconds to process that. I think that's wild. But I think the narrative around that, because of the fact that people did die and people had to really do stuff that was so difficult for mental health, I think that idea of public grief maybe became a bit more prescient. But also there is a couple of poems that touch on climate change in here, and I think I want to talk about climate change as a form of grief, but as a form of grief that's quite active. It's not about us kind of like locking ourselves away and being like, it's really hopeless and crying. It's like mourning the fact that we're in this position, but then also having the kind of anger and inciting elements of grief to kind of push us forward into action, I think. So it's interesting. I don't think I sat down and was like, I'm going to write a brief poem about the union strikes and climate change, but it's all kind of come out in a way.
I think when you're collecting the poems for a pamphlet, you start to pull threads and so on together, and you've had to edit them together and pull them together. So that leads me very deftly onto the editing process, which we had Hannah Lavery, who unfortunately isn't in the Central Belt at the moment. She's away on some writing retreat somewhere up north.
Stop being a legend, because she's just so cool.
Yeah.
It's like, Hannah Lavery, man, oh my God, when she agreed to come on board, I was just like, really me? But I'm just me.
That's a bit about the process, the editing process.
Yeah, it was really useful. I think Hannah said something incredibly insightful that I was like, Hannah, this is like, you have come into this Zoom to edit this collection, but I feel like you have edited my life. Which we were talking a lot about poetry as a kind of language form, and how some poets can get very into this language that's almost a shared language between other poets that can feel quite impenetrable in a way. And I think that is totally fine and valid. I'm really not here to be like, but I am correct. But that there have been so many poems I've read that I have struggled with, and that has made me, and sometimes that's been positive, and sometimes that's been like, but I have a degree, I should understand this poem. And she made a beautiful point about trying to make these poems the most understandable they could be, while still like being beautiful, unusual use of language. And that was so useful about like walking that line about like, I would really like for anybody to be able to pick up this pamphlet, even if poetry is not something that they ever engage with, and kind of have a sense of where I'm coming from. And I think everyone who reads it will have their own take and their own perspectives, and that's the joy of reading more generally. But I didn't want people to pick it up and just be like, I can't understand this at all. I really am not trying to start poetry beef. I just really feel like I need to make that clear. But I wanted it to be, I think all poems warrant rereading, and they will hit you in different ways at different points depending on when you read them. But I wanted this to be something that someone who never reads poetry could also kind of pick up and just feel that they kind of got what I was saying, even if they weren't necessarily 100% there with me.
And I'd also say someone who's read them a lot of times, they do actually hold up very well to repeated reading. And it's a real pleasure hearing you actually read them out loud to us, because I've not heard you read them, which is kind of an odd thing for me because I've read them so many times. What we're going to do is I'm going to see, does anybody have any questions that you have for Catherine? Would you have a think?
Yeah, I
have
could.
A little think.
If people are nervous as well, I could read a poem whilst people are thinking and then come back.
Yeah, that
And
sounds
then
good.
you have time to brew.
There's someone online called Jen who has asked, do you have a favorite poem in the collection?
Oh,
Choose your favourite child.
it's probably the last one, which I was gonna finish by reading, which is where the title comes from. So when I first wrote this pamphlet, I did not have a title for it, and I called it Bird Watching. And then I basically said to Hannah, please come up with a different title. I hate bird watching so much, and I'm really scared ornithologists are gonna pick this up and be like, where were the birds? Where was the bird watching? So we went through all of my poems pretty much line by line, just picking out lines that we liked, and her saying, what do you think the pamphlet is doing, which was surprisingly difficult, because I was like, it's poems, it's a list of poems. But we picked the title from this last poem. I could read that, and then if anyone else has any questions after that, maybe we'd be so blown away by this lovely ending poem. So yeah, this is the last poem in the collection, and it's one of the other bird poems. I wanted to write a poem about blackbirds, because I've spoken a bit about birds, and I'm a bit of a fraud in that the person who really got me into birds was my husband, because he would speak a lot about the birds that he liked seeing around, and this is really strange because you're there. I feel like I'm explaining your life to you. So this was a poem for him. Before he was my husband, he told me that another word for home was blackbird. What else feels as reliable as that call, the opening of the year which all other birds can only hope to catch up to? When I'm travel drunk in airports, the first noise I hear is them yelling at a lamppost. We look out the window of the house he grew up in, and I'm thankful for all the blackbirds we have found together. Thank you. So yeah,
Yep.
And your last point about union, which I think is a beautiful way to collectively grief and anger that we process much better when we get out of it. How does it feel like to have someone like Hannah explain your work to you in a way that it seems like
really useful because I think so. One thing that poem originally had quite a different ending and had a kind of it was much more, I think, because I said it was kind of written about people watching, and it had kind of lines that were like, I really want to see your joy, and I really want you to be happy. And then I was talking to Hannah about it, and Hannah was like, I think this is a union poem, but I don't think you should end like that, because it kind of gives this message of like, cheer up, workers, which like as a poet is just like really grim, of like looking at people who are going through just horrific denial of their rights and their needs in line with inflation. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole too much, and then kind of just saying like, yeah, you should be happy and chipper, that would be really nice, thank you. It was really useful because I hadn't actually had that much of a lens on it, and then she kind of went through it and said, but so much of it is you're just talking about the people who make society run, which was especially interesting because I wrote it before COVID, and then looking back on it, all the jobs that were listed in there were the people who were like the frontline heroes. So yeah, it was, and I think a lot of what also went into it a wee bit was, my mum and dad are a teacher and a nurse, so it's impossible not to be quite political. Growing up in that household, like two of the careers that have been taken the most advantage of, really, especially during times like COVID and especially now with the strikes. So it was interesting because I was like, this is just a nice thing about walking down the road and seeing people and they're all happy and that's nice. And then Anna was like, happiness is political. So yeah, it is. It's that editing process is so useful in that there were some poems where she was like, I really see what you mean. And there were some poems where she was like, I think I know what you mean, but that word is confusing. And then there were ones like this where she was like, you mean this? And I was like, do you know? But it's nice seeing a poem change. And I think that's goes back to where I've started in spoken word. I mean, and poems were so fluid because you'd be performing them in front of an audience and seeing what literally just be like, are you entertained? Like, are people listening? And you would change and edit all, like between each performance. So I'm not, it's a weird thing in a way, kind of publishing where you're like, these poems have a solid form now and they're not as amorphous. But I do think they change over time. And I think the meanings still change over time.
I think if I can chip in as a publisher as to why we pair people up with editors as what we always do, even though it's for a pamphlet, and not everyone does that for a pamphlet, but to give you the experience of having an editor and to have that time to focus on your work with that kind of a real laser lens on what you have done. You're not in a writing group, they're there for you, I think is really useful as a poet to clarify what you've done. But it's kind of that time that you can put into it, and to have that other pair of eyes is really important. And it's something that we feel is about. The poems are there, everything is, we've selected it because it speaks to us, but it's that giving it that little extra shine, that little moment to kind of bring out the sparkle. It's a bit like finding the right lighting, I think. It's that's what you're looking for. And I think Hannah was a really good fit, and I'm really, really pleased that she did that. It was really great of her. Do we have any more questions in the audience though? Yes. Hello.
We've also been doing a lot of prose publishing. Birds are also a theme there. Are there some themes that you find suit poetry or prose better, or is it just kind of like whatever you write at the time?
What a dream question.
Can you repeat it for the crowd online?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'll repeat the question. So the question was, so I also write fiction, and there's crossover in some of the themes, notably birds. And are there themes that I think suit prose better than poetry, vice versa? That's a good yeah. Yes, let's say yes. I think I approach writing them really differently. So I only started writing fiction kind of 2019, 2020, because I had more time to do so. And I'm a very impatient writer. I like having a first draft done very, very quickly, which is why I think I wrote poetry for so long. You can write a first draft and it's done. I think the way that I approach poems is much more on a word basis. I'll kind of think of an idea that I like the sound of in my head as like a line, and I'll think, oh, that's interesting, and kind of play with it. And I do a lot of, before I start writing a poem, I do a lot of playing in my head, and I can almost write a first draft kind of in my head before I write it down. Whereas with a story, there's much more. I know where the story's going to start and I know where it's going to end, but I often don't know the middle at all. And one of the short stories I've written is this was published by Extra Teeth a couple of years ago, was a choose your own adventure where the option was you could marry a cuckoo, kookaburra, or you could run away from your house into the woods. And it was kind of vaguely dystopian feminist, there are no men, only birds story. It was very strange. It has a very different perspective on birds in that they are kind of like this menacing replacement for men and marriage, which is I am happily married. I'm very happily married. Yeah, I think a lot of when I write fiction, I often subvert something. Like I'll think about, because a lot of the fiction I write is also got more of a kind of horror edge. I will often think about something that makes me happy and then be like, but what if it made me unhappy? And that's often kind of a starting place. So I'll be like, what's the worst thing that could ever happen? And then write that. Whereas yeah, my stories are very horrible. I think if you went and read this and the rest of the short stories, you'd be like, wow, she has two very different personalities. Whereas poems often come much more from like trying to encapsulate a moment. And I think starting in spoken word, there's this very interesting assumption when you tell a story in spoken word, it's often widely assumed by the audience you're telling the truth, and that it would feel disingenuous to not tell the truth. I'm not saying that assumption is correct, and I think it has changed, but that was my experience when I was starting, especially in the kind of slam open mic scene. If you did a poem where it was like, I do this, and then it wasn't true, people would be a bit like, what? You know, if you did a poem about going through grief and you hadn't gone through that grief, I think people would find you a bit disingenuous. Whereas in a short story, you'd be like, I'm going to do whatever I want. But I do think my poems do start more from truth and things that have happened to me, whereas the fiction's a bit different. But it is interesting. Sometimes you write the same idea and then you're like, one day there will be a Wikipedia and it'll be like themes and motifs. And it'll be like birds and very horrible things. What was that?
Decided to get a pet bird. Any more questions online?
There's one online from Maggie. Is there a theme you haven't written about that you would like to?
These questions are so good. Like,
Nice one, Maggie.
the literature degree people really turned out with their themes and motifs. Sorry, it's such a good question. I'm not actually sure. So in terms of poetry, I would like to do a lot more stuff that is maybe more political, but also there was one response to this pamphlet which was really nice, that was like talking about like joy is essential and advocating for joy and happiness instead of survival, and how actually that can feel very revolutionary at the moment. And I think I want to write more about that. I think I read a lot of what I would call eco-punk sci-fi, which is just like the future is great and we all figured it out, and you know, just like quite utopian fiction. And that's something I'd love to extend that more. I think I have done that a wee bit in this, but I like the idea of just really advocating much more for happiness on a wider scale. And then in the fiction, I'll just write something really bleak and horrible. I'm writing a story at the moment based on a true story about a woman who, when she died, said, whoever stays with my coffin for a full year will get my entire inheritance. And I just think that is so cool that I was like, I'm going to write a story about that. But she made it as horrible as possible. So when you went down to the tomb, it was covered in mirrors, and you could only leave for one walk a day at 5 a.m. where there would be no one else in the graveyard, and you had all your meals brought to you by a servant, but you couldn't talk to them. So poetry half, let's do some advocating for joy. Writing half, let's do something like really horrific and dark about rich people misusing their money after death.
Good pairing.
Any more online?
No more online.
Or kind of find your ideas that will let you explore.
I'll repeat that. So a question about were there any poems that got left out or cut out, or any lines that got cut out? Yes, there was a lot of very angry poems actually that didn't make it. Before I first submitted, this manuscript looked a lot angrier. And I think that was because I kind of started with poems I'd maybe had published elsewhere and looked at them and looked at the common themes and then pared it down. And actually, when I was pulling this together, I wasn't actually convinced I had 20 poems. I was like, I've been writing for 10 years and I have like 3 poems that are good. So I did actually have to do some, I did actually have to, when I started thinking about pulling this together, go away and write some. But yeah, the ones that really got cut were some that were quite significantly angrier, I would say, like really angry about treatment from other people surrounding some of the stuff I've been through. Yeah, so I cut out the anger a little bit, not entirely, because I think it's really there in some of the stuff about climate change, but it would have been a very different pamphlet, I think, if I'd kept some of that stuff in. I think it would have been a bit harsher, and then I kind of thought I wanted to go more in a direction of kind of solace, and I felt the anger would be best placed elsewhere, because otherwise it did feel very like roller coastery all over the place.
I think that coherence shows through, and definitely we picked up on it when we read it. So one of the things that you've done, which we often advise when people ask for tips about submitting, is if you're just putting together like your 20 favorite poems that you've done, that's nice, but it's going to be like a mixtape that you made when you were 9 or 10. Also, I'm in my 40s, so mixtapes are totally relevant thing for me. I think maybe we do playlists on Spotify. Is that what we're doing now? Okay, so anyway, when you're putting together a pamphlet, you actually do want to kind of give it that more themed look, and you kind of go through it and work out what needs to go in, and I think that really shows in the strength of when we're seeing it, and it is definitely a really good thing, and I think that showed already in your work, and that was, thank you. It was a considered submission in comparison. Very lovely.
Oh, thank you.
So would you like to read us a few more of your wonderful poems and tell us a bit about them as we go along?
Yeah, absolutely.
Smashing.
I'm so sorry. I feel like I've just continually slammed into your feet the entire night. So the next poem, a lot of people will ask where poems come from, and the next poem was when lockdown was kind of easing up. One day I went for a walk and I realized you could smell other people again, and I got really emotional.
Yeah.
And I was like, I've smelled a person. I've smelled signs of life. I was trying to explain this to Hannah, because Hannah was like, what's this poem about? And I was like, smelling people. And she was like, you are very strange. And I'm not going to say too much about it, except that the last lines are true. They are genuinely true, and it's wild. So now I've overhyped it. Anyway, coming out of lockdown, the world opened like a stocked fridge. Streets smell like coffee and cigarettes, passed between greedy fingers, greasy pizzas, boys showered in Lynx Africa. I'm a street sommelier, sucking up signs of life like a fat bee high on abandoned iron brew, whilst in the sky a seagull carries a jam donut in the scissors of his beak. And it's true. I thought I was like dreaming. I was like, what the full jam donut. I think that seagull just had the best day of his life. It was like, the people are here again and they're leaving me their scraps. So that I spoke a little bit earlier about that positive existentialism. We're going to go back to the positive existentialism. So when this collection was originally called Bird Watching in My Head, this felt like the kind of title poem. This felt like the thesis statement. It's interesting to see how this shifted. But this was my theory about why existentialism is good, actually, and how when it's, I mean, I'm probably just saying nature is good, really, actually. I'm probably not being very revolutionary here. Probably just saying, like, you know, the number one thing a doctor says to you when you're like, I'm sad, and they're like, go outside. So this was about why the kind of bird watching came about. When it's too much, I take myself bird watching. This practice is not about collection or identification or even knowledge. It is about movement. It is about the thrum beneath a tiny chest. It is about the dead beetles in the dirt, the dried up patches of dirt. It is about the humble species like blackbirds and house sparrows and wrens, and when it is too much, perhaps even seagulls. It is about the way our lives are so small, so painfully small. It is their ignorance held like a handful of walnuts. I borrow it for now. Yeah, a very good top tip is if you're ever feeling a bit low, go outside, look at a bird. What would the bird think? You're probably fine. Listen, the birds don't care. And that's a really beautiful thing. Another bird I wanted to write about was, someone asked earlier about the themes in poetry writing, and something that I keep on my desk all the time is I have quite a few books on superstitions because I'm kind of obsessed with them, because I think they are fascinating, the way that we've looked at very everyday humdrum things and to kind of have a sense of security, made up stories about them. And one of them is magpies, because in some cultures magpies are like very bad, but maybe good if there's enough of them. And in some cultures they're very, very positive. And you get like these really, really weird kind of superstitions that you're not even sure where they came from. Like there's a whole one about you can't have peacock feathers in the house because they're like evil eyes or something. So I've read a lot of superstitions about birds, because sometimes I'm like, I need to write something, and then I'll go and read a superstition and be like, ooh, that's weird, I'll write that. But I kind of feel a bit sorry for magpies, because I think I really, really like magpies quite a lot. And when I was a kid, my mum, we didn't have the one for sorrow, two for joy thing. We just had to say morning, Mr. Magpie. Every magpie, morning, Mr. Magpie. Don't know why all these magpies were male. They're running out of magpies because there's no women magpies. But I wanted to write one about them because I think they're not doing any harm. Somehow we've decided one for sorrow, and that's maybe he's just on his own for a walk. Maybe lay off. I love the gorgeous cheek of you, the refusal to fit to human concepts of property and ownership. I have counted you like prayer beads, held your name in my mouth like a good luck charm, saluted you from pedestrian crossings and exam hall windows. And I know when I wonder if I've ever seen the same bird twice, the feeling will never be mutual. But when you skirt the rain to sit next to my window, I hope you know your magic still sits with me. Have you ever thought about that? Like, do you ever think you've seen the same birds twice and you just never know? No, everyone here is much more well adjusted than I am. That's fine. We have one magpie that sits in our garden quite a lot, and its feathers were all like a bit messy, and we called it Raggedy Mag for ages. And then one day I was like, Raggedy Mag might be 5 different magpies. I might be looking at Raggedy Mag like, it's Raggedy Mag, and Raggedy Mag might be like, who are you? Why do you keep running to the window? Leave me be. But I hope Raggedy Mag is the same one, because he's actually been several times where he came and sat on my windowsill when I've been writing. And every time my brain does this thing where I'm like, I have a demon, like in Philip Pullman. That is part of my soul. I don't think other people do that. I'm going to do one last poem. So for about 6 months, I used to work at St Giles Cathedral, and I worked behind the welcome desk with the volunteers, and it was one of the most interesting experiences of my life. I was very, very bad at being a tour guide, like so horrifically bad. I would just forget things all the time and then make things up. Like I'd be like, see this bell? There's a hole around this bell because they believed that like the music was coming from heaven. And people were like, oh my God. And I'm like, this is not true. And people would be like, when was this bit built? And they'd be like, 1739. No, I really don't know. I would just panic, and instead of doing the normal thing of being like, oh, I'm really sorry, I don't know, I can double check that for you, I'd just be like, give them an answer. And I used to get really, really positive reviews on TripAdvisor. I used to get these reviews like, that Scottish lass who took us up the bell tower, she made our trip to Scotland, I'll tell you that. And I'd be like, it's all lies. It was all lies. What if Betty and Margaret go home and tell all their friends it was built in 1739 and it wasn't? But the part of the job I loved was sitting behind the desk, because it would be me and another volunteer, and most of them were people who had retired, and you would start talking with them kind of in a small talk way, and then they would have the most wild story about their life. Like one of them was this guy who was like an architect when he was growing up, and he was growing up before he retired, he was an architect, and he was telling me about like, oh yeah, we didn't used to have the kind of safety equipment, so I used to just walk around on roofs, and several times I thought I was going to die. And I'm like, sir, it's 10 a.m. on a Sunday, what are you doing? And I had one woman who like told me she worked in a hospital, and then eventually she basically told me that she would helped invent IVF, and I was like, man, that's something you should open conversations with. But they were all so lovely, and it was a very eccentric, strange place to work. But despite being a terrible tour guide, I just loved spending time with those volunteers. I just thought they were the most exciting people, and I just thought there was something so beautiful about the idea of you could spend your Saturday and Sunday in any way you want, but you've decided to come and show very grumpy, angry tourists around this very old building. So this is based on a day working at St Giles. It's called Olives in St Giles Cathedral, which I think Muriel Spark should have written a book called that. Olives in St Giles Cathedral is such a Muriel Spark title. I'll give that to her posthumously. You can have that, Muriel. This one's for you, Muriel. Read one of Muriel Spark's books. I very, very much liked it. But Olives in St Giles, it's got a vibe. Behind the welcome desk, she revealed a bottle from home, impossibly yellow against the grey flagstones. I imagined her picking her way through the shops to find the ideal weight for him, a colleague she hardly knew, her hands testing the middle spot between embarrassment and disappointment. I thought about him, scaring tourists with his hatred of selfie sticks, how we often speak to each other in such quiet gestures that we have to turn our backs from the magnitudes they contain, like the taste of olive oil that flew so many miles to the kitchen table of his one-bedroom flat.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. And I'm so thrilled that this book is now out. I hope everybody's getting a copy. But thank you all so much for coming. We can do some mingling and signing. You want to do mingling and signing?
I'm very up for signing. I will say, I did this whole thing where I was like, I won't sign with my actual signature because what if someone one day steals my credit card? And then I was like, that's not a thing people think about, is it?
About that.
It is. I'm not crazy, I promise.
Yeah, so mingling and signing. So if you would like to do that, please do hang around. We're going to switch our mics off, and thank you so much again.